Let us start. My name is László Brust. I'm the co-director of the Democracy Institute of the Central European University. We'd like to welcome you and this very interesting panel that deals with this question of is deep polarization in society a driver of autocratization. Since we have excellent group of panelists, politicians and eggheads or political scientists, we are really well versed to discuss this question. Let me introduce first the panelists and then ask a few questions. We have Andreas Schädler, who is the lead researcher of the DEN Redemocratization working group of the Democracy Institute, Filip Milacic, a senior researcher at the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung, Katalin Cseh, member of the European Parliament and vice president of Renew Europe, then Johanna Lutz, who is the head of the Vienna office of the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung, and Branimir Jovancicevic. I hope you will excuse me for my Serbian pronunciation. We can't hear you. If you unmute yourself, it will be better. Branimir, we can't hear you.
Okay, now you hear me, yes?
Yeah. Now that's getting closer to something that you would like to say.
In the Budapest, but I think that we'll be successful on this way too. Okay.
Okay, thank you. So we deal with this question of deep polarization and so the link between polarization and autocratization. And one of the occasions of this panel, it's not just that there is a deep polarization that plays a very important role in what's going on in many of the countries of the globe, not just in Hungary, but in many other countries. But we have just out a new publication from the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung of a research on identity, partisanship, and polarization with the title How Democratically Elected Politicians Get Away with Autocratizing Their Country. It's a very interesting piece co-authored by two of the participants of this panel, Johanna Lutz and Filip Milacic, but also among the authors we have Elena Avramovska and Milan Zvolik, whose piece on polarization appeared 2 years ago in the American Political Science Review, and that was actually a very influential piece on polarization. Now, the question is about the link between polarization and autocratization. So let's start with the scholarship on this issue. We are assumed, and actually when I studied political sociology, we actually had to read a piece from Klaus Offe, in which Offe says that democratic elections are a civilized form of civil war. That is, so to say, polarization is sort of part of the normal functioning of democracy. At least time to time, every fourth year, there is an extreme version of polarization among interests and values, and after that, the elections in a way settle this conflict for the next 4 years, don't solve this problem, of course, but they create a settlement in which someone gets the opportunity to govern based on the values and interests, and others have to be in opposition and wait for the next round of elections. So polarization is part of normal functioning of democracy. Now, of course, we have polarization in the recent literature more with adjectives like deep polarization or pernicious polarization. So there must be something in this polarization that might be not so kosher, something that is not so good. So my first question is to Andreas. what is polarization? And how would you just discuss? How would you start discussing this issue of what's the link between polarization and autocratization? Yes.
Thank you. All right. I would say I would not answer directly. I would like to not answer your question directly, but that's kind of where I would like to go to. The overall question of the panel, as we know, is whether depolarization affects or
Sorry,
drives
I can't hear something
autocratization.
wrong.
And the common sense in the literature would be a clear and resounding yes. If you read the comparative literature on autocratization, on the global crisis of democracy, on democratic backsliding, whatever the precise label, it is almost invariably associated with polarization. So that's really that's a kind of common sense, and I think it's good to whenever we see that kind of common sense is to say, okay, how clear is it really? Do we know what we are talking about? How firm does it hold? And what exactly is it we are referring to? So it's really it's a huge concern in public debate, and precisely because of that association, because of that intuitive association. And it's a huge topic in comparative political science. I did a tiny research, and more than half of all the papers, all the articles published on the topic in political science have appeared over the past 7 years. So it's really together with the debate on autocratization, we have that on polarization. And if you look at the literature, it contains long lists of democratic damages polarization is supposed to cause. I have the references if you wish, but here's just the list of damages to democracy attributed to polarization. The first thing is always prevalence of confrontation over cooperation, moderation, and compromise, which are supposed to be the basis of liberal democracy. A host of performance failures due to radical policy swings, the entrenchment of policy positions, policy statements, and problems of coalition formation. Then we have a long list of democratic attitudes which are supposed to erode in context of polarization. Trust in government, trust in public institutions, trust among citizens, democratic satisfaction, democratic support, the legitimacy of elections, democratic legitimacy overall. All these things are supposed to suffer under polarization. And then it's not just what is the core of the Friedrich Ebert's study, the tolerance for anti-democratic behavior, and even the support for anti-democratic behavior, but anti-democratic behavior itself. So we are supposed to see the surge of contentious politics, democratic transgressions, political violence, and even the destruction of democracy in the wake of polarization. There's one nice quotation by Giovanni Sartori, who is kind of the outstanding figure in earlier debates on polarization. And back in the 80s, he wrote, the best single explanatory variable for stable versus unstable, functioning versus non-functioning, successful versus immobile, and easy versus difficult democracy is polarization. And today we have kind of a similar consensus, kind of that idea against what you said, Laszlo, initially, against kind of Klaus Offe's notion that this is something normal. We now have really something like probably even a moral panic, but really deep concerns associated with polarization. So when we have all these causal intuitions, I think we really get back to your question, Laszlo. Okay, if polarization is supposed to generate all these damaging consequences, what kind of beast is it? What are we talking about? How comes that an abstract bundle of dynamics may wreaks such havoc on democracy. And if you look at U.S. political science and the study of U.S. American democracy and the kind of the slow emergence of studies of polarization over the past decades, even before current debates on democratic backsliding, there precisely we see a very similar intuition to Klaus Office. Basically, in the U.S., colleagues have been startled by observing the transformation of a two-party system where parties were really quite indistinct of each other, overlapping ideologically, hard to differentiate. Kind of a muddled situation we Europeans always thought was kind of pathological. And now they have seen a disentanglement of their parties who have been gotten more and more programmatically distinct, which means ideologically coherent internally and ideologically distinct among each other. And so US political scientists would talk about this process of programmatic differentiation as polarization. And because they do so, they basically describe something which is basic to democratic competition, meaningful programmatic differences between parties, between competitors, between candidates. They describe it as polarization, and they think, well, up to a certain degree, it's good for democracy. It's normal in democracy, and everybody would agree. And I think this is also kind of the background why we are asked to think about the effects of deep polarization. Laszlo, you mentioned polarization with adjectives. Yes, we have that. We have kind of people distinguishing between kind of this normal programmatic differences, which I think we shouldn't really describe as polarization, but they put kind of adjectives like thin and weak and beneficial polarization to it, and all the rest is extreme and pernicious and harsh or deep polarization. So it's not quite clear what it is, but it's clearly a realm of political conflict that exceeds what we normally expect in a democracy. So we would all agree democracy is not a system for kind of to uphold harmony or to manage harmony, but to process conflict. And polarization seems to be, or at least deep polarization, seems to describe a situation where conflicts go out of hand, where they are excessive according to our democratic standards. I think when we start thinking about, well, which kinds of conflicts might be excessive for democracy, this is really a very muddled field. And I think in the political science debate and polarization, we have not been sufficiently precise about that. And there are basically three dimensions in the literature. One which is kind of the classic, the substantive dimension, that polarization is about policy conflict over material interests, ideas, social values, left, right, conservative, progressive, etc. Then the second thing would be a moral dimension, where polarization would describe a situation where people divide the world into good versus bad people. So we are the decent ones, and the other are evil actors who mean who are ill-faithed and mean harm to the polity. And then there is something I think we have been overlooking, and which is a third dimension I'm trying to introduce, which is, or emphasize, a democratic dimension, which basically consists of mutual perceptions of adversaries as enemies of democracy. And here I really think here we have a clear connection to democratic damages of polarization. If polarization is a situation where political actors come to perceive the other side as a threat to democracy, then it's much clearer to see how that is damaging to democracy. In the other dimensions, we may very well go with Klaus Offe and say, that's the way democracy works. It's supposed to be about, yes, harsh conflicts, perhaps not civil war. That's a metaphor. I wouldn't talk about that. But it is about real high stakes, passionate, meaningful conflict. And it often does involve the idea that, okay, the other guys, they're really self-serving, amoral, uncaring for the common good, for our conceptions of the common good at least. So substantive and moral conflicts we might consider as normal in democracy, but kind of the idea that we are playing by the rules and the others don't, the others are a threat to our democratic coexistence because they violate the basics of democracy, I think this is really threatening. And if you think about kind of what happens with democracy in a situation where where adversaries, we view each others as enemies of democracy, basically. So this mutual charges. So the main implications, and just a short list, it cancels any possibility of constituting a united front of Democrats against anti-democrats, because there are two fronts of Democrats against anti-democrats, at least on a subjective level. Then both sides in this conflict will be tempted to, well, defend democracy in ways that may be undermining democracy. And whatever they do in the defense of democratic values, the other side is bound to perceive it as, well, just another attack on democracy. Just look at the US. The US, I think, is the perfect illustration of these things right now. And so violations of democratic norms by one side and violations of democratic norms by the other, and perceived norm transgressions, kind of the hallmark of polarization, end up driving actual norm transgressions, autocratization. So in a nutshell, and I'm concluding, what polarization does in this crucial democratic dimension of mutual perceptions of democratic threats, it upsets democracy as a system of reciprocal norm compliance. In democracy, we don't ask anybody just to be a good guy and comply with democratic norms, regardless of what others do. We comply with democratic norms under the expectations that others do so as well. And when this expectation goes through the roof, almost everything else goes through the roof as well. So it really unravels the system of reciprocal cooperation that forms the very heart of democracy. Thank you.
The second question to Johanna and Philip, that this expectation has to be stable, that everyone plays by these rules, and transgression of democratic norms will be punished by the voters, that the electorate will not reward, actually, but will punish those who limit the political freedoms of others or tilt the playing field towards themselves arbitrarily. So surprisingly, this is not the finding of Johanna and Philip. So I would like to, you in whichever order, to start to elaborate on this issue, that as your title implies, that there are factors that actually are between this civilized form of civil war and so that would, so to say, tame the conflict to stay within the realm of democratic norms.
Yeah, thank you. About punishing and punishing behavior, that's basically, that was the outset of our research that we did, that we applied to European countries, 7 European countries. And because, Andreas, as you said, it's polarization and how polarization threatens democracy, it's being debated everywhere. And we really wanted to see what influence does it really have, and what are the mechanisms, how does polarization really work. And the basically option that voters have is to punish someone at the ballot box if if someone, like a politician, behaves undemocratically. And we basically copied a research together with Milan Svolik from Yale University that he had done in the US a couple of years ago, and applied this to Germany, Poland, Estonia, Spain, Serbia, and Ukraine, and wanted to see whether the same the mechanism works in the same way as it does apparently in the US, where then he established that polarization really is a driver for the threat to democracy or for autocratization. And what we found, and we did an experimental setup, we didn't just ask people directly, but we really basically created a scenario where all the survey participants had to do candidate choices, and therefore we could see how would voters really act if they are exposed to a situation where they have to decide between somebody who holds or proposes an undemocratic measure, but also at the same time has stands for certain policy positions that that are in their interest, or who belongs to a party that they support. And what we found that was voters in Europe, in these 7 European countries we investigated, tend to trade off democratic values for their partisan interests, mostly. So they are partisan more than they are Democrats. So whenever a politician proposed an undemocratic measure, if that politician came from the party that these voters supported, they would win this election by a really big margin. So when we found that the average punishment, that means like a candidate would lose on average in Europe minus 7.8%. But then whenever there was the favorite party candidate, they would gain another like 20 up to almost 30%. So this was overruling. And we were really surprised by this, because we also heard like people don't really trust parties, but apparently they do trust their preferred party for some reason. And we also saw that some policy people also traded democracy off for their policy interests. And we also found that these were mostly, we had different policy issues that we tested, and we found that it's mostly identity-related policies that voters were ready to give up democracy for, and socioeconomic policy issues did not really play such a big role. And we also found that we really tested. We didn't just generalize polarization, as it's often done in some of these indices, which of course makes sense. We say, okay, this society is very polarized and the other one is perhaps less polarized or so. But we really measured how polarized people were over all these policy issues from these different areas that we tested. And there we found that people in these 7 European countries are polarized over different issues. So in Eastern Europe, for example, in our 5 Eastern European countries, we saw that they are heavily polarized, or the most polarizing issue was the rights for same-sex couples. Whereas in the Western European countries, it was different. It was immigration in Sweden, environmental policy in Germany, and the use of minority language in Spain. And so we see that actually the polarization could lie on in a different policy field in these countries. And then we also see, when we tested how much are people willing to punish undemocratic behavior, or how much are they willing to forgive if it comes to a polarizing issue. We found very different, like really a mixed result. It wasn't like in Svolik's US study, where we saw that whenever they are polarized, they really forgive undemocratic behavior. But we found that for these for same-sex couples' rights, they were almost always ready to give up to tolerate undemocratic behavior, and so sometimes we found that polarizing and the polarizing issue or polarization of a certain issue and forgiving undemocratic behavior comes together. But we also had cases where this wasn't the case. For example, in Spain is not polarized over same-sex couples' rights, but they still would tolerate undemocratic behavior for this. And we also saw these for different issues in different countries, and we even saw that there is polarization on an issue that is Poland, where they are heavily polarized around environmental policy, but they would not tolerate undemocratic behavior for this. So that's actually exactly the contrary example. There is polarization, but no, the Polish would still punish an undemocratic behavior nevertheless. So with this a bit more, let's say, finer examination of the mechanism of how polarization could work, we came to a very diverse finding, and we could say there are perhaps also other factors at play, not just polarization.
Mm-hmm. Thanks a lot, Philip.
If I may just add, well, Andreas mentioned that various aspects that are mentioned also in the literature about how concretely polarization threatens democracy. And then Johanna said that basically we measure polarization in our study. We didn't only base our findings on this. There is German expression Bauchgefühl, that would be like a stomach feeling. So on anecdotic evidence, we actually measured, we investigated policy polarization, measured, and we saw that some interests are polarizing, and for those interests, voters would sacrifice democracy, but there are also interests that are not polarizing, but voters would still sacrifice democracy for them. So basically, we see here this mechanism that citizens, they stop becoming citizens and they start acting as fans. And as fans, they want that their team wins, and then it's no matter what costs are. And this is what is regarded as the biggest threat for democracy. However, according to our data, we see that citizens, they're also becoming fans for interests that are not polarized. So, and this is the key puzzle basically that we identified in our findings. So we think that this, based on these findings, we think that the theory on polarization need to be refined. So. And that some other factors are here at play regarding the decisions of voters to forgive undemocratic behavior. We also offered some potential explanations. So one of them would be to focus on group interests, group identities, group loyalties, so that people also, they cling to those interests even though the interests are not polarizing. And also what we also offered is the role of the political actors. So, and to be more precise, the role of political entrepreneurs, who by weaponizing and politicizing these issues are not only deepening polarization, but making them salient, so that many voters would still sacrifice democracy for them. And since we have two political actors here on the panel, I'm really eager to hear your opinion on the role of political actors in these processes.
Thanks a lot. Actually, you just prepared my question to them, because we researchers of polarization or democratization or redemocratization, we study probabilities, and they are the masters of possibilities. So my question to Katalin and then to Branimir, two politicians, active politicians in this panel, question is, first, what are for you signs of deep or pernicious polarization? And how do you think politicians can fight against them? Katalin, you might start.
Yes, thank you. And it's always fascinating to speak after these scholars, because I always learn so much from you. Let me try to provide for the audience a bit more practical examples of what was already mentioned before. And let me just start with how polarization appears in society and in political life. And let me just come with a very, very concrete case that I actually experienced recently in the election campaign. One of many. So imagine a small town in Hungary. It's in the northeast part. It's one of the poorest neighborhoods of this country. And I'm speaking to an old lady who comes to our booth that is set up in the market hall. So she starts complaining that she couldn't afford to live from her pension, that the air quality is so bad there is corruption everywhere, and she sees like all the things that are like going on in the country, and she is not happy. All her grandchildren are living in somewhere in the West. She doesn't even see them, I don't know, once in 5 years. So she has a lot of problems, a lot of complaints. And so I asked her, so do you plan to turn up at the election and vote? She was like, of course, I'm coming to vote. I'm voting for Fidesz, the governing party. And I'm like, okay, but you just like listed all the reasons that you have problems with. Oh yes, but I am very afraid that if Mr. Orban loses, then the migrants would come and the European Union would force LGBTQ transsexual surgery on the kids in the kindergarten. And she totally said that. And she was nice. She understood me. She came to me. She had all these problems. She had a very good picture, I think, about the problems in her community. But she just like cared about the these made-up threats that were used to polarize her group against an imaginary enemy. So this is just, I think, a very, very practical symptom of what is wrong in society. And let me just come in with another point. So the entire discussion beforehand was about whether voters are mindful enough of democratic challenges in order to rank them above polarization and also some anti-democratic means. And I think the big question here is whether voters do even care about democracy that much anymore, because I'm not sure that's the case. I saw very, very worrying studies that polled all across Europe. It was basically a choice between two options, something on the line that whether you would prefer a well-functioning democratic state or a more effective one-man rule. So it was something on that scale. And for instance, in the case of Hungary, but not only that, quite a strong majority of people prefer the one-man rule. So democracy wasn't that much of an attractive option anymore. And if we are just like starting off from this context, it's easier and easier for those who try to use polarization for their own political gains to surpass democracy as something that, is like very theoretical, it's in the past, this is not only the only option. So if we are on this trajectory, then I think there really has to be a lot of political work done to change that and to really point out to people that why does democracy matter for them. And this is where I think we really have a lot to do, because all these concepts can seem so abstract, so big, so far away. And what polarizing actors use in the day-to-day political discourse is to really try to pitch people against each other, try to deepen these divisions within society, try to blow up imaginary threats so that voters do not recognize the real threats that are actually preying on their everyday life. And as we are heading into just another economic crisis, I am very much afraid that these tendencies will be even stronger and stronger. So what politicians can do, I think it's first is engagement and dialogue. Try not to get into this game, because it's very, very easy. And I have to say that also the Hungarian opposition is a bit guilty here. Because if there is this polarizing blame game going on, it's kind of easy to take the side that like, yes, but you are destroying democracy. And as it was heard before, that is like one of the problems that you also listed. Of course, the real question is like, what do you say if you're a politician and your opponent is actually destroying democracy? So, but indeed, we should be probably using more compromise language. We should move towards the middle. We should try to make better reasons and also grassroots community building to try to make these people connect with each other. But this is not easy. And social media and also the lack of regulation in many, many walks of life, regulations in regards to electoral campaigns, political advertising, intransparent media rules really facilitate the media environment that has been fueling this polarization. So just to close here, what I think politicians should do, apart from changing our language maybe, is also to make better laws. And this is what we have to do also in the European Union to, for instance, create a new European Media Act, which would enable us to prevent further divisions that are artificially ingrained in society by malicious actors from the outside, but also from the inside. But it's a hard work, and we are very much neck deep in this problem. So we need to climb out of here somehow. Thank you.
Thank you. Branimir.
Yes, first of all...
some louder a little.
Do you hear me? You hear me, yes? Do you hear me now?
Just a little better.
Okay, but I hear you very good.
Okay, yeah, that's good, fine.
Okay. First of all, thank you very much for the opportunity to talk today. This panel discussion is really great. It's a pleasure and honor for me, Mr. Laszlo Bruce, on the first place. Okay, maybe you had the opportunity to talk and to introduce. I am here only one participant to this Zoom application, and because of that, only several sentences. Let me introduce myself. I'm the professor of chemistry at Belgrade University, and industrial chemistry and mental chemistry, and I am the chief of the chair of applied chemistry at the Faculty of Chemistry. Actually, I'm coming from natural sciences. I'm not a sociologist, it's something similar. And I can say that also on the other side, the vice president of the Democratic Party in Serbia and the president of a committee for the environment in the Democratic Party. Last political election in Serbia in 1st April, I was elected for the Serbian Assembly, for the Serbian Parliament. And now, concerning this very interesting, on the first place, sociological topic, and as a chemist and vice president of one Democratic Party, I would like to present you one example of Serbia. What is the influence of polarization and autocratization to the political system and political situation in Serbia? Of course, as a professor of environmental, I would like to talk about the influence of populist autocratic system on the protection of the environment, and within that on climate trends. Two basic theses are: why are citizens' requests to solve problems ignored in such a system? The second thesis would refer to the complete discrimination of experts in an autocratic regime. And I think that I provide you the answer after this short talk about the real situation, political situation in Serbia today. This year, Swedish institute, the name of that institute is We Dem, Varieties of Democracy, qualified Serbia among 6 countries in the world with the highest level of autocratization, together with Brazil, Turkey, Hungary, India, and Poland. 2 of these 6 countries are members of the European Union. According to this report, Serbia is an electoral autocracy whose quality of democracy declined for more than 40% compared to the situation of 10 years ago. Why is this important for us today? The process of autocratization typically follows a pattern, and it has been no different in our case. Ruling government first attacks to media and civil society, and polarize by presenting of opponents and spreading false information. Only then undermines the elections. This is exactly what has been happening in Serbia for the last 10 years. Ruling regime has taken over most of the media, controls regulatory bodies, and holds the national emitters in its hands. This means not only that there is no space for the opposition and citizens of Serbia on a state television with the national frequency, but also that there is no space for professional journalists that would know the citizens everything that is going on in our country. It made it sound unbelievable, and this is something we talk all the time, but there is vast majority of citizens of Serbia who do not know what is the case with a lot of very, how to say, pleasant events in Serbia. Do not be mistaken that the elections held this year gigantic, even to when we are in the we speak given by the president in being broadcasted on the first channel, watched by everyone, and are speeches of members of are being moved to the less watched channel. Within full control, and I would have to say, satanization of the political opponents, our society become extremely polarized, and I'm afraid that it will be a long process of coming back after current regime lost its power. This polarization is so great that it was possible to use so big force on a peaceful Protestant in the front of National Assembly, for example, 2020, to look at the police beat citizens who are peacefully sitting on the bench or continue beating those who are already on the ground without wider reaction. This polarization is so big that it was possible to organize criminals to attack citizens protesting peacefully on Sava Bridge in Shabac with hammers and mechanization, while the police leaves the event knowing that the citizens will have to defend themselves. This polarization is so high that it was possible to kick out children from the kindergarten just because their parents are members of the Democratic Party and their neighbors, other parents, citizens of the same municipality did not rise up their voices to defend them. People are afraid for their own lives and economic existence. Regime holds the media, violence is rising, polarization at its peak, and it seems like there are no good news. But I think that there are. I believe we managed to create a forced solidarity during the last couple of years, but present at every protest by being there, every citizen whose rights have been violated, by being brave to talk about what is happening. We have seen this during the protest, for example, against Rio Tinto, as the citizens have shown courage and unity like they haven't for a long time. We have a long way to go, but the spark, let's say, is there. And I'm sure that by showing solidarity and persistent choosing the right topics and realistic goals, along with getting the support from our friends all across Europe and entire world, Serbia becomes a democracy and good place to live where citizens see their future. And because of that, now we are not in the situation to talk about some how to say, topics which are very interesting concerning trends and the environment, education, etc., because the real situation in Serbia, due to polarization and autocratization, is extremely bad. Thank you very much, and I'm open for discussion later.
Thank you so much. We have 15 to 20 minutes more. If any of the panelists would like to add something to the debate right now, I would like to give them the opportunity, but otherwise I would open the floor. Andreas.
Yeah, just one quick but important thing. Katalin, you said, yeah, sometimes you're facing an opponent who really is tearing down democracy. And I think I was thinking about kind of situations we describe as democratic equilibria, established democracies, and which are the dynamics here. Once autocratization is successful, and you are in a either in messy ground or in Hungary, many of us would describe it as an electoral authoritarian regime, then of course it's part of democratic opposition to call the things by their names. And so I think that's a very important difference we need to draw, distinction.
Thanks. Any other panelists now? Then I would like to open the floor for sharp and short questions or comments. Who would like to be the first? Let's see. Yes? Yeah. Okay. Just a second.
Hello, my name is Attila Szabó. I'm a lawyer from the Hungarian Civil Liberties Union. So I care about human rights. That's my position. And my question would be, what do you think about the social dimension of the polarization? Which social aspects can be important in this process? I would think that the education and the people have a job or don't have a job, this kind of things might be important. And also the rural and urban aspect might be also important, but I'm very curious about your opinion. And my second question would be what politicians which kind of tools they have to influence these social dimensions and how they can solve the polarization in these different social groups. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Any more now? Okay, who would like to start? It's very important. These are questions that are open both to our politicians and scholars in the panel. Katalin? Yeah.
So if you mean the social dimensions in a way that what social differences could be used to further fuel this process, then I would say like really any difference can be blown up to this big quarry between you and someone else. And this is really the master plan, I believe, for some of the autocrats to really try to inflate normal social differences, normal ideas that people might disagree on into this like big and mortal threat to your group. Really dividing society to us and them is absolutely the fundamental baseline for many of the leaders who tend to exploit our differences in order to further their solidification of power. And really, it can be anything. You have a hat, I don't have a hat. You are a man, I'm a woman. Anything. The hat. The guys, the people in hats are an opposing group, and the girl in blazers have to be afraid of them because would you force me to wear a hat? No, why? So really, it can be anything, and this is what we've experienced in Hungary but also in other countries for the past years. I believe that really if you have a strong enough hold on power or a strong enough narrative or a strong enough political strategist, it is very, very easy to pit people just against each other. Of course, social differences, a country where certain groups are developing better than others can be a clear division of specifying what the threat is, and here, of course, very fundamental and the very basic examples are like, people with different skin colors, people with different religion, people who live somewhere else than you. But I just really want to stress it, or I don't know if the academics agree with me or not, but these groups and these divisions are not fixed and not concrete, and really it can. A polarizing situation can evolve around really basically anything, in my opinion, because fear of the unknown, fear of change, fear of the enemy is really so much ingrained in people. It's really at the bottom of the Maslow pyramid that if you just play hard enough here, people will start to care about problems that are actually not problems at all. and just give you a closing argument, and maybe for you it's obvious, but for those who are non-Hungarians, Hungarians were afraid of migrants in towns where like not one single migrant have arrived. But due to the media effect and due to the political propaganda, it was possible to rally Hungarians against people who are not even in the country, who are not even in their community, who would face like no real threat to them. There is absolutely no connection. So examples like that can be really found all across the spectrum, and the main thing here is try to address the bottom causes of it.
But also that might be linked to polarization, social polarization that was before that. That is, they are afraid of even further insecurities. I think that was your question. Andreas wanted to say something, and then Johanna, and then we open for the other question.
Yeah, I think it is a very important question, but a very difficult one. And I don't think we have good answers. From the US literature, the way we have been talking about social polarization is very in a language of, we talk about social or affective polarization, very often with an emphasis on, as the term says it, on emotions. You know, two groups that harbor a hatred against each other, don't like each other. We have feeling thermometers to measure that. We have social dynamics where they start kind of distancing, kind of sorting each other into different residential areas, institutions, etc. And very often the kind of the basic theory that undergirds that literature is social identity theory, which basically says what you just said, kind of just draw a difference between two groups and you create these emotional reactions of hatred and competition and etc. I'm a bit doubtful and wary about that. I think that's kind of a soccer theory, a soccer club theory of polarization. Kind of, it doesn't matter what it is. It could be sports. It could be it could be just some item of fashion. I don't think that's the case. I think usually it may be, the problems that ignite these divisions may be imaginary. They may, the crisis, the threat, they may be rhetorical, invented, without real basis in reality, in what we recognize as reality. But I do think that usually these emotions are what psychologists call evaluative emotions. They are grounded in normative judgments. So I am angry against you because you committed some injustice. My indignation comes of my sense that you treat lousily other people, etc. So usually these deep emotions, they have normative, they are fed by normative judgments. And I think it's important to try to understand these in order to be able to do what you also recommended, to open up to dialogue and to not kind of burn the bridges of interaction and dialogue. I myself, from my personal constitution, I'm very much in favor of dialogue, but very much of what we have in the literature tells us it's of no good, it's of no use. People won't listen. So we have a huge literature on motivated reasoning, which is basically telling us, well, people don't kind of just weight arguments and weight evidence and then integrate everything into a fresh judgment. No, they just integrate everything into the world they already have made up in their mind. So they're immune to new arguments, immune to irritations, immune to anything we might be telling them. So that makes us skeptical towards kind of the power of fresh information, dialogue, interaction, etc. So something some colleagues have been telling us that, well, you should do like the mayor of Budapest or of Istanbul, kind of instead of feeding the polarization and engaging with your adversary, just introduce kind of positive narratives, emphasize all the good things you want to do. These are probably, I think, recipes for the local level. At the national level, I think it's it's important and unavoidable to name the democratic norm violations others are committing, and to really be outspoken about it, but also to be conscious about the difficulties of mobilizing citizens on the basis of these, let's say, democratic grievances, to make them understand what we're talking about, to make them care more about this than about other issues. It's very difficult.
I think, well, I would slightly disagree. I think which is perhaps good for the discussion. What we see in our experiment is that as I said, the socioeconomic issues didn't really move people that much, although we formulated them in a way that it would really affect everyone. Like it was about like income tax, so at least everyone who has an income would be affected, or it was about taxes on different energies. So also everyone has to heat or use electricity somehow. It would affect everyone. Yet people were, even though sometimes they said it's an important issue to them, when we tested whether they would act on this importance or not, we found that they didn't really care so much. They rather than cared about other things, whereas all the, let's say, identity policies issues, these were really much more salient or much more polarizing. And even though I think something like the rights for same-sex couples doesn't really affect that many people, yet it mobilized them so much that even in a country where Spain, where it's more or less consensus, there was no polarization on the rights for same-sex couples, and it doesn't affect maybe 5 to 10% of the people, they disregarded anything else. Like politicians could suggest to prosecute journalists who report badly about the government, or like we had tested various options, as you see in the report, and they would know. But this other thing that's more important. And I think it is, or we are still speculating, and really we only could test the behavior, let's say, and now we are looking forward to the discussions with the sociologists or political psychologists and so on to find out what is it. But we can see from the data it's usually identity issue. And I think, as you said, Kathleen, what we often see then, that if there is actually an economic need, for example, or behind an issue or a concern, that if politicians manage to politicize a certain topic in a way that they frame it as an identity issue, and that's what gets people mobilizing, be it that they are polarizing over it, or that it's just becoming very salient. But like everyone, perhaps in some village in Hungary or also Germany, like everyone's like against the migrants. There's no polarization about migration, basically, because everyone's against it. So, but it's so strong that that they act accordingly. And regarding, we also tested different socioeconomic status or other characteristics of voters in general, how would they act on if they would tolerate undemocratic behavior. And there we could see differences. We could put people in groups that in general, in all these 7 European countries, we see that women, for example, punish undemocratic behavior more than men do. We see that people who are more trusting, punish more. People who are less authoritarian punish more. And then we have, regarding age, for example, mostly, yes, younger people punish more, but not in all countries. We have a couple of countries where it's not the case. And also in Germany, for example, it's actually the boomers generation that punishes more than young people. And then we have a very, very interesting finding for Poland, which is only in Poland, the people who have a lower economic status, let's say, who assess their own family's economic status or the country's economic prospects badly, they punish much more, like clearly. And that's really interesting. In all the other countries, it's the more well-off people who punish more. So I think it's diverse and depending on the country, so we can't always generalize, and it's really important to look, at the different people and professions, backgrounds, and so on, if we really want to, find a strategy.
Yeah, I'll be brief. I also must say I disagree with Andreas, because I'm a fan of social identity theories, because I think that we really need to change our assumption about human nature, because there is a lot of research in psychology and neuroscience saying that how this in-group, out-group thinking is innate to us, that we are really, it's tribalism is innate to us. We have also back from the 70s, when you had the famous Teufels experiment, who showed how it's easy to mobilize one group against the other group, and even on some totally meaningless criteria. And I think that political entrepreneurs, they know that very well, and this is why they are successful. And because these group identities and group belonging does mean a lot to the people. And I will only name one example from our study. Basically, we see in Spain that people would not sacrifice democracy if you would promise them to pay less taxes. So basically to have more money in their pocket, but they would sacrifice democracy if you would ban Catalan people to speak Catalan when communicating with state offices. And this basically affects maybe one person in this state institution that would have to learn Catalan, or that would have to hire a translator, and nobody else from the majority, but they would still sacrifice democracy so that the minority speakers would not have right to use their language when communicating with state. So I think this is one of example that shows how this perception of group identity is important to the people. So what can we do about it? I think that political leadership is essential. So basically, in two words, I think we need progressive Orbans who know how to counter these threats.
Thanks. A brief intervention. No, and then you. Sorry, I don't know the names.
Ernst Hillebrand, I'm also from the Friedrich Ebert Foundation. Just a brief remark on this point, because it interests me since years. I would rather go with the academic research. I say that it's not possible to mobilize people along any topic. These topics you can use, they are based on moral and value assumptions that people have. And I can only recommend you to read this marvelous book of Jonathan Haidt, The Righteous Mind, Why Good People Are Divided by Politics and Religion, which traces back the polarization of American politics to some very basic moral values that underlie the thinking and the judgment of ordinary citizens worldwide. And the problem, he says, with the modern politics is so much of our policy issues today are no longer social issues, economic issues, or other things. They are political questions that are related to moral values of people. And especially the progressive agenda today, I would say, which does no longer insist so much on economic and social questions, but much more on value issues, has been pushing the field of politics very deeply into the field of moral assumptions, moral values. And that's this pushing of the political agenda into these moral and social cultural questions that has been giving the raw material to conservative, for this reactionary conservative backlash, and this very successful strategy of polarizing society, putting good people against each other. I think that, and we have to understand the mechanism. The mechanism is because it is about very deep-rooted moral judgment of people. It's not anything. It's not having to wear a hat or not. These are much deeper-rooted, hardwired moral values that are concerned here. And really, read this book. It's marvelous and very eye-opening. Thank you.
Please pass over to behind you.
Thank you. I would just like to ask a question about the tools. I mean, I don't know if you at all took a deep look into it, but in this theory that you're presenting in this study, what role do the digital tools play in in actually, building up this theory. I was wondering if you could comment on this, because as far as I understand, also national populists do have a much better domain of the superficial message, like in the sense of identity messages and stuff. And this is the easiest message to spread in a tweet or in a Facebook post or whatever. And somehow the progressive message is a bit more complex and not so much superficial and easy to disseminate. And I was wondering if you believe that the progressive political options and civil society organizations are in disadvantage compared to the more national populistic options, and especially with regard to use of technologies.
We have -2 minutes to answer this question. Who is going to just very brief answer to this question? Joanna?
Ernst, thanks for the recommendation. I'll have to read the book. I've read only a couple of essays, but yeah, I agree with these findings. Regarding the questions, no, we had a very, let's say, tight frame of how to do this experiment. It was really about voting behavior, because that's the way where you can punish politicians. The only aspect that we found was we asked people whether they used, whether they were politically engaged, and we gave them a couple of options to tick. And what we saw, also very surprisingly, no explanation for that, is that people who are more politically engaged, but in general it wasn't many people at all who were politically engaged, but they punish less. Why that is, I don't know, and then among these engagement there were also a possibility to be active or post your views, like political views, on social media. Do you do this? And if they do this, they're even less likely to be otherwise politically engaged. So, and then even on top, they punish undemocratic behavior less. So, and we also saw that sometimes people who vote for other parties than the ones we selected, or sometimes non-voters would also perhaps punish more. They're actually more, active.
Okay, Katalin, really please.
Yes, just very briefly. So I just want to say that I essentially agree with your analysis. I just wanted to say that, of course, the values underneath all conflicts are really these like moral, basic fundamental divisions. But I just wanted to make a point about, I think nowadays with the internet and with our societies, the divisions in which these divisions and these fears are manifesting are much more complex and much more diverse compared to what it used to be. So it's not only like, where do you live, where do you study, which is your religion, but there can be like really fights about, if you just go on the internet, it's like vegans versus meat eaters. Do you like this series or not? Which character are you rooting for? There are just so many manifestations, I believe, of the same fears and same divisions that it can really appear at very, very unexpected places. So that is what I wanted to say, but I will also read the book. And
let me add that polarization around such moral issues can be a very important tool for democratization. Think of Martin Luther King or other movements similar to that. The last thing that remains to me is to thank the panelists, the exciting contributions, and for you, for your patience and wonderful questions, and enjoy the remaining sessions of this forum. Thanks a lot.
Thanks a lot. And goodbye from Belgrade.
Bye.
Bye-bye.